Firstly, let's talk about gold itself. Now, there's a lot of investors out there have high expectations of gold. They think gold's going to go to $5,000 an ounce and all those sorts of things. We'll talk about that in a bit. But why do you think it is that gold has such a perceived value across investors around the world?
It's historic, largely. And we can go into it later. People say that it might be a relic. But the reality is gold is fundamentally a currency. But unlike most of the currencies in the world, it's not a currency that can be devalued. You can't print it. You can mine more out of it out of the ground, but the rate of mining tends to be a lot slower than the rate of people and growth of economies in the world, or has been historically. So gold, since the beginning of time, has been a currency and value because it is relatively rare. It can't be destroyed, and it can't be printed when governments or
but that's an old argument now. We just print paper, don't we?
Well, yeah, that's exactly the point, though. You print paper, you can't print gold. Gold has intrinsic value, and gold, when real rates of return become negative, so when you've printed too much money and the money multiplier has an effect, and sort of the money multiplier is a theory that you print a certain amount of money, you have a certain amount of money, and that money changes hands. And as that money changes hands, the money supply, it's the M1, M2, M3 concept. It grows. So when our economies are growing, whether you're printing money or not, the amount of money in the universe expands, so to speak. When you print more of it, the expansion becomes slightly more exponential. That can contract occasionally because growth becomes slower. So when we had the financial crisis, growth contracted and money supply contracted. But the point being, money as we know it, the monies that are there's no currency in the world that hasn't failed at some point in time. There have been many, many currencies. There's been the most recent failure that we would know of would be the Deutschmark, for example. The Deutschmark or the Reichsmark failed and it was replaced by the Deutschmark. But paper currencies or currencies backed by governments are thousands of years old. The first paper currency was actually invented by the Chinese. The emperors of some of the first.
I thought it was Rome. I don't know why I thought it was the Roman Empire or whatever, but it shows what I know.
Interestingly, the Romans had coins that were not made of gold, but the fundamental basis, the Roman Empire lasted a very long time, as did the Roman currency. And one of the reasons they believed that was the case is because it was backed by gold. And all of the currencies that have ever been created up, even until now, have been backed by a certain amount of gold. But the gold tends to be hoarded by the power structure. So whether that's an emperor or a government, there's a certain amount of gold generally backing that currency because the gold's real and the paper's not.
Yeah, but governments are selling gold. Look at what's happened in the UK 10 years ago under that idiot who sold all our gold stocks.
Well, the fact that you think he's an idiot who sold all your gold says something.
Yes, true.
There's always been a thought that we don't need gold. And in a fast-growing and functioning economy, you don't need gold. But there's been no government over the history of time that hasn't succumbed to the need or the urge or whatever you want to call it at some point in time, whether you need to fund a war or your economy's faltering, at some point in time, everyone prints. And sometimes you can get it back, you can print a certain amount, and then the economy comes back a little, and that gets absorbed into the economy in a healthy way. Sometimes you print too much, like Zimbabwe or the Reich in Germany, and eventually that currency falls. Currencies have been falling. They last 50 years, 100 years, a few hundred years, but there's never been a history up until of a currency that's not failed except gold.
Well, it's interesting you say that because you study your history and you'll see what's going to happen in the future. So potentially, you look at the US, where they've been printing money for years. Is there a potential at some stage that the US currency dies?
Yes, and if history is a lesson, it will die eventually. Or, to be fair, it'll get reset. Now, I don't know if the US currency is going to fail in 10 years or 100 years. Nobody does. But the likelihood is at some point in time you get to something like the yen, where it's 1,000,000 yen to buy, I don't know, a postcard. And at that point in time, people often want to reset a currency. And that reset, where every 1,000,000 yen, for example, goes back to 1 yen or 1 yen 2 or whatever. If you look at the currencies of Europe, for example, that were replaced with the euro, the currencies of Europe were all deflated. The currency that was the least deflated in Europe at the time of converting to the euro was actually Germany. But even France, since the time the franc had been issued post-war, had been deflated since 1945, I think, to 10% of its value. And that was one of the least depreciations. Yeah. I think the lira had been devalued, and I might be getting my numbers wrong, to something like 5% of its value. I mean,
we might be seeing the lira again soon.
It looks that way, doesn't it? But that's a perfect example of the fact that the Italians want out of the euro because the euro is very constraining, because with the euro, they don't have the ability to print. So when their economy's in crisis, as it is now, they want to be able to print money to spur their economy into growth. And that printing is not possible. It's been a tool of governments for literally millennia, to print a little money to help get them over the next hump, whatever that hump may be. The reality is gold is a counterweight to that. So I'm not saying necessarily printing is a bad thing. It's just ultimately the function of printing, and there are various ways to print money rather than just a printing press. There's lots of ways. But ultimately, gold is the one currency that can't be printed, and it tends to be the one we come back to.